There are many ways in which a Christian life can be destabilised. In chapter 2 of Paul's letter to the young believers in Colossae, he's been addressing this subject. His concern has not been with the direct and obvious pressures of moral temptation. Those forces ought not to be underestimated, where the pressure comes to simply abandon in some area of your life any semblance of Christian manner of living and to flagrantly disregard God and Christ. That pressure is real enough, and it will be felt at various times in every Christian's life, in some part of your life or other. But there is something more fundamental and usually more subtle than blatant moral failure that can undermine a Christian life, and more often than not precedes any more obvious change in external behaviour. It can sneak up on you. It can rattle your faith in the Lord Jesus Christ well before that instability gets expressed in palpable moral stumbling. We've been listening to the series of warnings that have run through Colossians chapter 2, warnings about things that could undermine the firmness of your faith in Christ and therefore the good order of your life, as he described it in chapter 2 verse 5. These warnings started in chapter 2 verse 4 with the very general description of the danger that he's talking about in terms of being deceived. Chapter 2 verse 4, I say this in order that no one may deceive you by persuasive speech. We, like those Colossian believers, are to give attention to the apostle's teaching. We're to learn from him. We're to study his divinely inspired instruction so that we will not be deceived. That's why he wrote. And I remind you that that is the purpose of our study of the apostles' writings. As we struggle at times to understand just what he was saying, and I assure you that the preparation of this exposition has involved a lot of struggling, as you will soon see. I think actually listening to it's going to involve a lot of struggling, at least I hope it does. But the purpose is so much more important than the immediate task. It is so that we will not be deceived. And then, in case we are slow to see the importance of this, in verse 8, the possibility of being so deceived was vividly presented as a kind of being kidnapped. That was Paul's characterisation of the kind of persuasive speech that has the power to deceive. Learn to recognise it for what it is, and do not be taken in by it. And then, after a very important excursus in verses 9 through to 15, and we will have reason to return to that shortly, we come to the three warnings that round off the chapter. The first, in verses 16 and 17, was a warning about allowing shadows to pass judgment on substance. Persuasive speech by the advocates of shadow religion, insisting on the shadows and casting doubts on the sufficiency of the substance. Learn to recognise the voices of shadowland religion and do not be intimidated by them. The second of these three concluding warnings we heard last time we met together in this way, in verses 18 and 19. A warning about the arrogance of superior spirituality. Persuasive speech from those who've found something superior to Christ and his death and his resurrection. Now, while the language is rather strange to us and no doubt reflects ideas and beliefs and practices in the first century Mediterranean world, we have been finding that the apostles' words, when we listen carefully, sound a contemporary warning that we need to hear. Learn to recognise the voices of false spirituality, no matter how impressive, and hold fast to Christ. We come now to the warning that concludes Colossians chapter 2. This time some of the language really is very difficult, some almost impossible to translate, but as we will see, nonetheless, a word again with the power to stabilise Christian faith against destabilising influences. Here is a quite literal translation of verses 20 to 23 so that you can sense the difficulties, and then we'll try to see past the difficulties. I'm reading from verse 20. Since you died with Christ out from under the elements of the world, why, as if living in the world, be dictated to? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Which things are all for decay as they are used, according to the commandments and teachings of men, which, having indeed a reputation of wisdom in self-made religion and humility and severity to the body, but they are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh. I said it was difficult. But it begins with a reminder, again in verse 20, of the basic reality of the Christian life. You died with Christ. And in those 4 words we have the heart of the Christian life. You died with Christ. Remember how Paul elaborated this central truth of Christian existence in verses 9 through to 15. In that circumcision of Christ, you were circumcised. In that baptism of Christ, you were buried with him. His death was so truly for me that I died with him. My life is so dependently united to him that I died with him. Now, this is the powerful reality behind the whole series of warnings that we've been hearing. Someone wants to disqualify you from their superior spirituality. Don't give in to them for a moment. You died with Christ. Someone wants to pass judgment on you in regard to religious practices. Don't take a scrap of notice. You died with Christ. Don't let anyone take you in with any human philosophy. You died with Christ. Now, friends, I want to ask you to look carefully at that reality today. And I want to ask you to see this aspect of it. You died with Christ, the apostle tells us, out from under the elements of the world. Now, we heard that phrase, the elements of the world, back in verse 8, where it seemed to be Paul's rather derogatory dismissal of merely human philosophy as elementary. How basic can you get, really? At very best, dealing only with this world, and at that, only the elements of this world. Well, now he uses the same phrase to underline, it seems to me, that in dying with Christ, we are liberated from bondage to this world, from bondage to the powers that constitute this world, from bondage to the structure of this world, from bondage to the inevitabilities of this world. This world and the basic elements of which it is constituted no longer hold on to us, no longer own us or control us. You died with Christ out from under the elements of the world. Now, strange as Paul's way of putting it may be to our ears, do you see the reality of which he is speaking? Earlier in the letter, he spoke of how we have been reconciled to Christ in his death. The blood of his cross has made peace between us and God. And so do you see that your dying with Christ released you from bondage to this world and its forces, however you might understand those forces, and whichever ones you might like to think of. This is a very big deal. A very big deal. Since you died with Christ, your life must now be lived in an entirely new context, about which we will be hearing much more in chapter 3. But here Paul wants us to see the foolishness, the no sense of denying the basic reality. Why, he asks, would you go on living in the world? Now, we know very well from all that Paul will say in the rest of this letter, let alone his teaching in every other place, that he does not for a moment mean that Christian people should not live in the world in any sense. But when you've died with Christ, why would you live with the world as the shaping influence on you? Why would you live, in other words, as though your life is still held by the world, controlled by the forces of the world, subject to the elements of which the world is constituted? Did you die with Christ? Or didn't you? Can you see that your answer to that question has huge consequences for how your life is related now to the world? Now, it seems to me that this vital truth could be taken in several different directions. The denial of the basic reality of the Christian life, the denial can be lived out in many different ways. Since you died with Christ, out from under the elements of the world, why is it that you are so anxious about your life in this world? About your possessions, your prosperity, or whatever it might be? Since you died with Christ out from under the elements of the world, why is it that you fear the forces of the world? The forces, whatever they might be, of status or lack of it, of reputation or lack of it, of admiration or scorn. Since you died with Christ, out from under the elements of the world, why is it that this world can still terrify you? However, Paul pushes us in an unexpected direction, a direction we would not, I think, have taken. You see what he says? Since you died with Christ out from under the elements of the world, why, as if living in the world, be dictated to? Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. What is he getting at? I still have my doubts that this letter is a response to a particular teaching in Colossae, or that Paul is suggesting that the Colossian believers have actually fallen into some error. More likely, again it seems to me, he is warning of the kind of thing that he had seen again and again and again. And if I may interpret him rather simply, he's asking, since you died with Christ out from under the elements of the world, why would you allow your life to be controlled by rules about stuff in this world? Now, the obvious candidate for the kind of thing that he had in mind, I'm sure, would be Jewish food laws, just as he'd already mentioned that kind of thing in verse 16. Let no one judge you in regard to food, in regard to drink. Such rules are not the kind of thing that shapes your life now. You died with Christ, remember, out from under the elements of the world. But if I'm right that he is talking about the kind of thing that he's seen again and again, rather than a particular problem in Colossae, we should reflect on the kind of thing in our experience that would in principle be the same. Now, this is not easy. I think it's particularly not easy in the Christian circles most of us come from, because I suspect that at this point we have learnt rather well from the apostle, or we think we have. By and large, am I not right? We are people who have little patience for arbitrary rules. Every rule we come up with here at college, there's a dozen of you, no there's 20, no there's 100 of you who want to know why, and that rule must be justified, etc., etc. And it does seem to me that Paul is implying a certain arbitrariness about the kind of rules he's talking about. Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch. Indeed, perhaps partly under the influence of Paul's teaching here, my impression is that we have little patience with rules of any kind. Which of us really wants to be dictated to by rules? But I must say, it is at least a little less clear to me that our aversion to rules is always a consequence of our having died with Christ. And so, I am far from persuaded that rejecting any role for any kind of rule in the Christian life or in the Christian fellowship is itself a sign that we've learnt the lesson of this passage. Consider how a part of the response to the horrendous cases of sexual misconduct and abuse in some churches has been the drawing up of a formal set of rules about what is and what is not acceptable behaviour by people in public ministry, and making that code of conduct public and insisting that Christian ministers agree to abide by it. Do you think that the person who refuses to be bound by such rules is necessarily showing that he or she has died with Christ? What would you want to say to the minister or the ministry candidate who responded to such a code of practice by saying, since I died with Christ, out from under the elements of the rule, I will not be dictated to? Is that an understanding of this passage? Is that a correct understanding of this passage? Is that a clear sign of superior godliness? I think I might be inclined to remind such a person that it was the same Apostle Paul who could say elsewhere in another context, this is my rule in all the churches. Find it for yourself. There might be a few other things I'd like to say to such a person. But having said all that, I want to come back, for it seems to me that as we hear Paul's sharp critique of the life dictated by rules, there is something to be learnt, even about sensible and wise and responsible rule making. And so we read on with some trepidation into 22 and 23. For in verses 22 and 23 he spells out the problem of such living. First, verse 22a, the kind of rules people put themselves under deal with things that all decay with use, he says. Now this is very obvious, or the sense in which this is true is very obvious if Paul has in mind rules like Jewish food laws. He's speaking very much like Jesus in Mark chapter 7. But if he has in mind a wider range of rules that can be taken to determine one's life, he's highlighting a general problem with such rules. They can deal only with this world. They can deal only with this decaying world. Rules must at least be seen in perspective, particularly if you've died with Christ out from under the elements of the world. Rules are extremely limited in what they can encompass. They cannot even begin to do for you what Christ's death has done for you. The second problem with rule-dictated living, verse 22b, is that such rules are only human. And again, Paul sounds very much like Jesus when he quoted Isaiah 29 verse 13, "In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men," in the very context in Mark chapter 7. You died with Christ. Why would you allow your life now to be shaped by human rules? The third problem with rule-dictated living, verse 23a, is that the reputation of such rules does not match the reality. The Greek of verse 23 gets very difficult, and no doubt the difficulty is compounded by the fact that the kind of thing that Paul had in mind was expressed in that first century world in ways unfamiliar to us. They have indeed a reputation of wisdom in self-made religion and humility and severity to the body. But perhaps it is not too much to say that we can still see how it is that rules can impress. You see the code of conduct, you read through the code of conduct and you say, wow, that's really something. That code of conduct will change things. That code of conduct really has covered every area. That code of conduct, as they thought of everything in that set of rules. And you follow that set of rules and it really will make a difference. You see, you can see rules, and indeed you can see the effects of following rules. A code of conduct can produce a pattern of life. A set of rules can indeed produce a pattern of religion, if you like. Rules can shape a piety. Rules can be hard on the body. Oh yes, if you're dictated to by rules, they'll have an effect. And the effect can be quite impressive. That's their attraction, you see. They really can change your life if you commit yourself to keeping a particular rule or rules. But may I remind you, you died with Christ. What do you think rules can do for you? The fourth thing that Paul says about rule-dictated living, verse 23b, is really difficult in Greek, but most would agree that it's a comment on the worthlessness of rules for what really matters. They are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh. Rules simply do not solve the problem of human living. That fallen nature, that self-indulgent nature, that God-ignoring nature, that pleasure-craving nature, that self-absorbed nature that we all know so well, what Paul often calls simply the flesh. You might hope that you'll get control of it with a set of rules, But why would you ever think such a thing? You died with Christ. Now, the consequences of what we have been hearing from Paul today, I believe, are considerable. I do not think that the conclusion to be drawn is that there is no place at all for rules of any kind, that there is no benefit at all that rules can ever bring to a Christian life or the Christian fellowship. However, on the one hand, Paul seems to be very strongly saying that there are rules that are useless. There are rules that can deceive you into thinking that you are pious and godly because you're following them and your life is shaped by them. Or indeed, there are rules that can deceive you into thinking that you are not pious or godly because you're not being shaped by them. That's not what Christ died to accomplish. On the other hand, even when rules are wise and sensible, do not be deceived into thinking that they can achieve much. Rules don't change people. Not really. Rules don't change hearts. Rules can't curb the flesh. That's what Christ's death was about. Did you or did you not die with Christ? Then the power that is to shape your life, it's not rules. It's the subject we'll be turning to next time.
We'll strive for your